Ladies and gentlemen, sisters, brothers, it's my great pleasure as Regent to welcome all of you to Blackfriars this evening for this annual lecture in honour of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas, as you know, occupies a central place, the central place in the Dominican intellectual tradition. He's one of the primary inspirations for our philosophical, theological and educational mission here in Oxford. And I think it's actually fitting that the good news came only today for me to share with you that the Master of the Order has recognised our work here as being a special project of the Order, serving as a centre of intellectual excellence. But it's also my especial pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Dr John Marenbon. John is Senior Research Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, Fellow of the British Academy, Editor of the Oxford Handbook of Medieval Philosophy, author of the Boethius volume in the Great Thinkers series, and much else. But I have another reason to be thankful to John in addition to his many writings. My first introduction to the thought and writings of Plato, Aristotle and Augustine when I was a young Cambridge undergraduate was through John. All of these great works encountered in a paper rather oddly entitled The English Moralists. And John taught with exceptional patience, kindness, and the offer of an occasional glass of whiskey. I've sometimes wondered in retrospect whether it was my botched essays on such figures that necessitated the spiritual aid. We can be confident that no scotch will be required to sustain us through this evening's lecture. I am delighted to invite John to address us now on Aquinas, Thomists, and the problem of paganism.
Firstly, thank you very much, Richard, for your kind introduction. I assure you that patience was never necessary when I was supervising you. And I'm delighted to have been invited and to be speaking to you this afternoon. The talk that I'm giving is linked to a large project on which I've been working to examine what I call the problem of paganism over a Middle Ages so long, stretching from the 5th to the end of the 17th century, that perhaps I shouldn't call it the Middle Ages at all. But I also have it very much in mind that I have the honour to be giving the Aquinas Lecture here among his own confreres at Blackfriars. I'm not an Aquinas specialist, and unlike many people who work on medieval philosophy, I didn't come to it through Aquinas. The 13th century has always seemed to me just one among many centuries of medieval philosophizing. And I've even somewhat resented, if I can admit it, in this place and among this company, the way in which Aquinas has come to represent all medieval philosophy in the popular imagination, thereby contracting more than a millennium into a few decades. In a sense, I suppose, in the various things I've written, what I've been trying to do is to counteract that impression and to suggest that medieval philosophy begins a lot earlier than Aquinas and goes on a lot later. But in fact, Aquinas brings his own cure for this ill. In the centuries after his death, there was a tradition of Thomism that is one of the strands of later medieval philosophy, one of its central strands. I want this afternoon to look at some of these usually neglected authors and their relation to Aquinas and each other, so that even if you're not interested in what I have to say about paganism, I hope that you'll feel that you learn something about the nature of the Thomist tradition. First, then, introduction, let me introduce these two different sides of my talk. Well, what do I mean by the problem of paganism? I can best show you through an example. An example taken not from Aquinas, but from another equally famous medieval writer, Dante. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with the figure of Virgil in Dante's Commedia. Virgil, who is Dante's guide through hell and purgatory, a revered authority, a wise teacher, but also, as is made clear even at his first appearance, a pagan who is condemned to hell, at least to the limbo of hell, because he lacked Christian faith. The questions posed by the figure of Virgil outline, in one of its main aspects, the problem of paganism. Why is he in hell? Was he really so virtuous as he seems to be? In what ways was his wisdom limited? And how do such limitations fit with his role as an authority? I've begun with this figure from Dante, rather than by taking something from Aquinas. Not just because Dante, as a poet, provides striking images which epitomize problems, but because he, Dante, was one of the outstanding medieval authors for whom the problem of paganism was a central concern. This list includes Augustine, Abelard, Holcott, as well as other poets such as Chaucer and Langland. It does not include Aquinas. Although he wrote a number of passages, as we shall see, which suggest solutions to various facets of the problem, Aquinas seems not to have been very concerned with pagans as such. Like most medieval philosophical theologians, he was content rather to make enormous use of pagan authorities, Aristotle especially, in a body of work which looks at problems firmly from his own and his readers' perspective, as Christians in a Christian society, confronted directly by heretics, and by two of three sorts of infideles, and I'll translate this word by the rather old-fashioned infidels. So, by two of the three sorts of infidels, people who are without Christian faith, that's to say Jews and Muslims, but not confronted in any serious sense at this time by the third sort, pagans. Aquinas was indeed aware that there existed some pagans in his own day. He placed them in the north, believing that in the east there were mainly either Muslims or schismatic Christians. So long as pagans were in the main and long since dead ones in antiquity, it was easy to use their work and to engage with general questions about the relation between reason and revelation, without reflecting especially on these people's status as pagans. But already, in Aquinas' time, although he seems not to have known or not to have been interested, the reports of the Franciscan ambassadors to the Mongols were revealing a vast world of paganism beyond Christendom and Islam. Exploration of India and the Canary Islands, and, most important, from the 16th century onwards, the conquest of America, made it impossible for thinkers to ignore the problem of paganism in what I call a second aspect. The aspect epitomized not by the cultivated figure of Virgil, but by the perhaps far more challenging figure of one of the cannibals in Montaigne's essay about it. So, a paper like this one might take up the idea, already proposed by some who studied the narrower subject of the salvation of pagans, of how, under the pressure of dealing with the issues raised by the Christian conquest of a pagan continent, Aquinas' general principles and disparate comments on infidels were forged into a coherent and powerful approach to the problem of paganism. Yet this will not be my argument, as you'll see. So let me turn to the other aspect of my introduction, introducing a bit more briefly the Thomists that I'm going to be discussing, along with Aquinas himself. The latest of these Thomist texts is, I believe, the earliest direct response in the Thomist tradition of Spanish activities in America, the Dominican Francisco de Vitoria's Relectio de Indies of 1539, which I'll come to at the end of the lecture. The other works are all even more closely linked to Aquinas. They are by Jean Caprol, or Capriolus, and Thomas de Neo, or Cajetan, and by Vittoria himself. Capriolus was following a long tradition stretching back to before Aquinas' time by making his major, indeed his only surviving work, begun in 1409, a commentary on Peter the Lombard's sentences. But the manner in which he wrote this commentary was thoroughly unexpected. The sentences had been adopted as the textbook in theology faculties along with the Bible, because they set out in an orderly way the main problems of theology, along with, in almost all cases, acceptable orthodox conclusions and some central patristic texts. Commenting on the sentences, therefore, provided a neutral basis for theologians of all sorts of different views to develop their theories and argue against opposing ones. And indeed, the questions actually discussed tended in the 14th century to become more and more detached from the Lombard's text and to reflect current theological interests. Capriolus, however, deals with each subsection of the sentences according to the following unchanging plan. First, he sets out Aquinas' positions on the matter at hand, in Aquinas' own words, quoting from the whole range of his works. Then, he sets out the arguments made by theologians between Aquinas' time and his own against these positions. Finally, with frequent quotations from Aquinas, he explains why these arguments are wrong, and so why Aquinas' positions can be accepted as correct. It's no wonder that this so-called commentary was titled Defensiones Theologiae Turnae Aquinatis. You must bear in mind that by the beginning of the 15th century, Aquinas was a theologian from a long bygone era. The language of theological discourse and the agenda for it had been reshaped by Henry of Ghent, especially by Scotus, and further changed by the early and mid-14th century nominalists. So it was a bold move to maintain that Aquinas' own work provided the answers to a host of objections he had never as such considered. But if Capriolus was original in his project, didn't the nature of that project mean his abandoning any claim to originality in carrying it out? Well, not exactly, since despite his fidelity to Aquinas, the act of excerpting and collecting together his texts in order to respond to developments in theology since his time could not but make a change to his thought. Cajetan was one of the earliest teachers at the beginning of the 16th century to use not the Lombard sentences, but rather Aquinas' Summa Theologiae as a basic textbook for theology. Even more surely than Capriolus' method, this move at once established for those who followed such a course Aquinas' position as fundamental. But because Cajetan had the role of a commentator, he also had more freedom to inflect, to develop, or demur from Aquinas' doctrines. Vittoria, teaching at Salamanca a few years later, also lectured on the Summa Theologiae. But he was willing to extend his discussions more freely. And where a matter was too complicated to be treated in the course of his ordinary lectures, he would dedicate a special lecture, or relectio, to it. Moreover, Vittoria wrote with Capriolus' Defensiones and Cajetan's commentary open on his desk, and so his writing is like a dialogue with these two predecessors, as well as with Aquinas himself. So, what I plan to do now is to consider some of the main answers that we found in Aquinas to the problem of paganism, and selectively to look at how some of these Thomists took up his ideas. I'll start with the question of pagan virtues. The conflict they raise is characteristic of the problem of paganism. Medieval thinkers knew or at least imagine from their reading of the classics that some Greeks and Romans before the coming of Christ had led lives of apparently exemplary virtue, Socrates or Cato or Regulus, for example. Yet it could be argued that since none of them was acting with the proper end in view, that's to say God, these virtues were little better than shams. That very roughly, some people would want to nuance it a great deal, was Augustine's position. According to most history books, this is an area where Aquinas, influenced by his great knowledge of Aristotle and his respect for him, differs from Augustine, and, while insisting that humans have a supernatural end, not attainable without faith, recognizes genuine natural virtues shared by pagans and Christians. Perhaps this is indeed the underlying tendency of his thought, but as we shall see, what he actually says is less clear. Theologians, now and in the Middle Ages, distinguish between the cardinal virtues prudence, temperance, courage, and wisdom, which are acquired, and the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, which are directly infused by God. In the Middle Ages, from the 12th century onwards, many theologians also distinguished a set of infused cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, courage, and wisdom, that were not acquired but infused directly by God into Christians at, so it was established in the 13th century, the moment of baptism. Aquinas fully accepted the doctrine of infused cardinal virtues. Just as the other acquired cardinal virtues are directed by prudence, which looks to synderasis, our innate grasp of ultimate moral principles, so the infused cardinal virtues are directed by infused prudence, which looks to faith for its principles of operation. Without these infused virtues, Aquinas believes, Christians could not consistently live their lives in accord with the theological virtues. At minimum, then, the doctrine of infused cardinal virtues means that there's a set of virtues unattainable by pagans. But Aquinas goes further. Discussing whether someone can be virtuous who doesn't have the infused theological virtue of charity, he admits that one can indeed, as many pagans did, have acquired moral virtues without charity. But insofar as virtues have truly and perfectly the definition of virtue, they must aim at humanity's supernatural end, and such virtues are those infused by God. And Aquinas continues, this is passage 1 on the handout which you will have. It is clear from what has been said that only infused virtues are perfect and should be called virtues without qualification, because they order people well to the end which is final without qualification. The other virtues, the acquired ones, are virtues in a qualified sense, not virtues without qualification, but they order people with regard to an ultimate end of some kind, but not with regard to the ultimate end without qualification. Cajetan's comments on this passage is remarkable because of the way in which it undoes the implications of Aquinas' text. This is passage 2. He says, the infused moral virtues are virtues without qualification, but the acquired ones qualified virtues, repeating Aquinas' text. And then he goes on. But you shouldn't think on this account that the author is here going against moral philosophy, and so against himself and also the others. It happens that different people put forward different judgments about the same thing in such a way that they seem to be contrary, but they are not. This is clearly so when a doctor judges from his illness that a sick person is about to die. An astrologer says that he's going to live longer because the movements of the stars promise a long life. For they both, according to their own reasons, put forward true judgment. And this is what happens in the case in question. Because if the judgment about acquired virtues is made according to human reasons, they are said to be and are among the greatest goods of humankind, and they are virtues without qualification. And this is what concerns the moral philosopher. But if they are judged according to supernatural and divine reasons, they are in this way and are said to be qualified virtues. And this is what concerns the theologian. For this reason, if you don't want to err on this matter, or for the creator of virtues to be despised willful, pay attention to whether the discussion is within natural or divine science, and in whichever it is, honour the truth which is put forward absolutely, because it is taken for granted in each branch of knowledge that it rejoices in what belongs to it. Cajetan's idea here of the autonomy of different disciplines is far nearer, I think, to something like the Olympus of Dacia and the so-called Latinitarius tradition than anything you'll find in Aquinas. And I can't help adding, though, in passing, that I think he chose a rather bad example, because if you have somebody who's ill and the astrologer says, oh, it's fine, he's going to live for years and years, and he dies the next day, it's hard to go on saying, well, the astrologer still said something that was true, at least in an astrological sort of way. So I don't know why he picked that example, which offers such an obvious objection. So I want to go on to another set of questions about pagan virtue, which Aquinas considers from a different angle, when he's discussing infidelity, condition of not having a Christian faith. There was some scriptural basis, such as the remark in Romans, that everything that doesn't come from faith is a sin, for thinking that every action of a pagan is sinful. Indeed, if, as Aquinas believed, actions are never indifferent, but either sinful or virtuous, then this would be a consequence of denying that pagans have virtue, in the real sense. But Aquinas dismisses this view rapidly. Infidels, including pagans, can't perform acts that are meritorious towards salvation, but they are able to perform, in some way, the good acts for which the good of nature is sufficient. Just as someone who has faith can sin by acting without having the end of faith in view, says Aquinas, so an infidel can act well when he does not make his end that of infidelity. In his fuller discussion of this point in his commentary on the sentences, Aquinas adds the point that we're not obliged to refer every act we perform to the final end, and so an act performed by an infidel isn't sinful just because it isn't directed towards this end. There are indeed some acts at some times which we are commanded to refer to God, and we do sin if we perform them without reference to the ultimate end. Aquinas, I think, found this a relatively easy problem to address, not one over which he needed to dwell. But the discussion of it was transformed by Gregory of Rimini, one of the most powerful and influential theologians in the mid-14th century, who combined the intellectual sophistication of Occam and his followers with a predilection for Augustine, especially the severe teaching of his later works on human evil and the need for grace. In his major work, the Lecture on Books 1 and 2 of the Sentences, Gregory includes a long discussion about whether the goodness or evil of an act should be judged by the goodness or evil of the agent's intention. Gregory argues that an act is morally good if and only if it has all the required aspects of a good act, and that if it's not morally good, it's morally evil and a sin. Among the required aspects are that the agent's intention is to the right end. If it is not, then the act is sinful. And Gregory argues against some theological contemporaries that for an act to be sinful, it has to be directed towards an end which is opposite to the correct one. It's simply enough for it not to be directed towards the right end. Now, the right end for any act is God, who alone is to be loved for his own sake. From this, Gregory draws the corollary that, and this is passage 3, no act of any of those who are infidels without qualification, by which he means pagans as opposed to Jews or Muslims, no act of those infidels is morally good. This is clear because none of their acts is done out of love for God or on God's account. Finally, since they do not know that he is to be loved for his own sake and other things for his sake. Therefore, no act of theirs is done with right intention, and so it is neither done virtuously nor morally well. Gregory recognizes that the stories we read of the moral virtues that were once displayed by many pagans could be used as an objection to this position, and so to the whole theory about what is required for an act to be good. But he's ready, indeed eager, to say that the virtues recounted were not true virtues. Using Augustine as his authority, he argues that the pagans didn't have true moral virtues, but rather ones that might be taught real, but were in truth nearer to vices than to true virtues. Aquinas' defenders were thus faced with a set of problems Aquinas himself hadn't needed to confront. Not the mere presence in the tradition of elements of Augustine's teaching, but a coherent and uncompromising presentation of an Augustine position. Capreolus, Cajetan, and Vittoria all consider the problem intricately. Capreolus builds his answer quite closely on the materials left by Aquinas, especially the idea that for an act where a person isn't bound by divine law, it is enough for it to be directed to some proximate good end, though he adds that this end must be one that is itself preferable to the final end. The central idea in Cajetan's discussion could be seen as an extension of this line of thought. The universe, Cajetan says, is in fact ordered with God as its end. He is then able to argue that although it's necessary to love God as the final end in order to act well, this requirement doesn't exclude infidels from their acts. And this is passage 4. To love God in this way, as the final end, happens in two ways, implicitly and explicitly. Explicitly, when someone directs his intention to it. Implicitly, when someone's inclinations are to things as they are. For, from the fact that things are rightly ordered and are ordered to God, with the universe as intermediary, an inclination which tends to things as they're set up in their gradations, tends to them implicitly as they exist for the sake of everything, and ultimately for the sake of God. With this in mind, he is able to argue first that in fact pagans can know that God is the end of all things through philosophy. But if they were not to know this, it is enough for avoiding sin in many of their actions to love and set their intentions on God implicitly, always inclining to things as they are, although this isn't sufficient for eternal salvation, nor to avoid all sins. Similarly, Cajetan explains that in the case of someone who explicitly desires to know philosophy without any other intention, he is implicitly desiring for the sake of the universe and God, because his inclination is tending towards the thing as it is. But is it really convincing to claim that we are loving God and in some sense setting our intention on him, just because we engage in the pursuit of some good in accord with the universe which is divinely ordered? Vittoria, at least, wasn't completely convinced. He doesn't reject outright what Cajetan says, but he doesn't think that it captures what we normally mean by the idea of things being referred to God, even virtually. He prefers simply to say that an act doesn't have to be referred to God in any way, even virtually, unless one means that it's referred to him just in this strange, shadowy way that Cajetan suggests. And so, according to Vittoria, one can either agree with Cajetan and say that an infidel does have to refer each act to God if it's not to be sinful, but it's enough to do so implicitly, or else one can follow Capreolus' view that acts can be good without being performed for the sake of the final good of God. I would say more about Vittoria's views on this point, because I'm going to be talking about him a good deal in connection with the other main area of Aquinas' response to the problem of paganism, to which I now turn. The question of whether and how a pagan can be saved. Central to this question is faith. Pagans are, as I've explained, a category of infidels. Their infidelity may be, Aquinas admits, purely negative if they've heard nothing of the Christian faith, in which case it's not sinful. But it remains the case that without faith, the road to hope and charity, and so to salvation, is blocked. The consequences of this position for the various sorts of pagans depend, though, on exactly what's meant by faith. And I should clarify two things before trying to explain Aquinas' theory. Firstly, the distinction he makes between explicit and implicit faith. If I have explicit faith about Q, then simply I believe that Q. If I have implicit faith about Q, then I don't believe that Q. Rather, I believe that P, where P stands in some special relation to Q. What is this relation? According to Aquinas' one detailed explanation in his Questions on Truth, it is that of a premise or set of premises to a conclusion that follows from. So I can be said to believe implicitly whatever follows from premises which I believe explicitly. That's one thing to explain. The second thing to explain more simply is Aquinas' distinction between minores and majores. So the lesser and the greater. The majores, the greater people, are those who in a particular society are learned in the respect under consideration. The others are the minores. So in Old Testament society, some of the kings and the prophets were the majores. In Aquinas' own society, the majores were the clerics, or at least the better educated of them. So, with this in mind, let's look at Aquinas' views. For someone to have faith of the sort that can lead to salvation, he or she must, Aquinas insists, have explicit faith in some of Christian doctrine. But the minimum requirements for this explicit faith differ in the period before the Incarnation from that in the period after it, and they differ as between majores and minores. Even before the Incarnation, the majores had to have explicit faith in Christ, and indeed the Old Testament prophets were considered to have had this faith, as is evidenced by their prophecies. The minores, however, needed only the explicit faith that God exists and he has providence over human affairs. Such explicit faith, Aquinas argues, means that people who hold it have implicit faith in Christ. And so, the salvation of those ancient pagans about whom medieval thinkers cared most about, that's to say the philosophers, is provided for. If you look at passage 5. The Gentiles were not counted among the instructors in the divine faith, and so, however wise they were in worldly wisdom, they should be counted among the minores. And so it was sufficient for them to have faith about the Redeemer implicitly, either in the faith of the law and the prophets, or even in divine providence itself. Aquinas goes on, though, to say that it is probable that the mystery of our redemption was divinely revealed to many even of the Gentiles before the coming of Christ, as is made evident by the prophecies of the Sibyls. And in a number of other places, he emphasizes that there was considerable public knowledge of prophecies of the Incarnation in ancient Greece and Rome. So, it seems that in many cases, these apparent pagans may have explicitly believed in Christ. But, in principle, implicit faith would have been enough for them. It's not enough, though, according to Aquinas, for those who live after the Incarnation, when even the minores are required to have an explicit faith in Christ. And this requirement raises, of course, a serious problem which Aquinas considers on a few occasions. Here's how he puts it in De Veritate. This is passage 6a. If we posit that it's necessary for salvation that something is believed explicitly, an unacceptable consequence follows. For it's possible that someone should grow up in the woods, even among wolves, and such a person cannot know of anything concerning the faith explicitly. And so there will be some person who, of necessity, will be damned. Aquinas replies, in very famous passage 6b, it pertains to divine providence that it should provide everyone with what is necessary for salvation, so long as it's not hindered on the person's part. For if someone who grew up in this way followed the lead of natural reason in desiring good and fleeing evil, it should most certainly be held that either God would reveal to him what is necessary for salvation by internal inspiration, or that he would send a preacher to him, as he sent Peter to Cornelius. As has often been noted, although this passage does provide, in principle, a way in which a pagan, even after the Incarnation, can be saved without any observable contact with Christian doctrine, it is very clearly supposed to be discussing an exceptional sort of case. Aquinas seems genuinely to have thought that Christianity had been preached in almost every part of the world, and so it was necessary to postulate extreme and unlikely circumstances for an example of someone who, after the Incarnation, knew nothing of Christian teaching. I take this to be less a matter of Aquinas' deficient geographical knowledge, though, than an indication of how the problem of paganism is pushed to the very edges of his thought. After all, even if one believed that Christianity had been preached everywhere, there must have been a period after the Incarnation, before the whole world heard the gospel, and many cases where a particular person has no chance of knowing about it. There is, though, another approach that can be found in Aquinas to the question about the salvation of the pagan after the Incarnation. Discussing a completely different topic about whether someone could have original and venial sin without mortal sin, Aquinas says specifically about an infidel that, this is passage 7a, before a person comes to the years of discretion, his lack of years, which prohibits the use of reason, excuses him from sin. Now, when he begins to have the use of reason, he is not entirely excused from venial and mortal sin. But the first thing which occurs to such a person to think about then is to deliberate about himself. And if indeed he orders himself to the due end, the remission of original sin through God will follow. If, however, he doesn't order himself to the due end, since at that age he is capable of discretion, he will sin mortally, not doing his intent. In answering one of the arguments, Aquinas goes on to make clear what's involved in his ordering himself to the due end. A person reaching the age of reason will be guilty of a mortal sin of omission, this is passage 7b, unless, as quickly as possible, he turns himself to God. For the first thing that happens to a person when he has discretion is that he thinks about himself, and he orders other things to himself as the end. I think it's wrong, though, to call this a theory of Aquinas' about the salvation of pagans. It is an incidental idea, and that one which he had early in his career commenting on sentences, but just threw it out in a three-line answer to an objection. However, it became, in the Thomistic tradition, an important theory, an important way of dealing with one aspect of the problem of paganism. Whereas Aquinas' more explicit discussion of the salvation of pagans, which we looked at before, receives disappointingly little comment from Cajetan, he discusses in detail the question of the first act of someone who reaches the age of reason. Now, from what Aquinas says, the passage I just read, it seems that the child is required to turn immediately to God, or else he or she sins. And this is exactly how Capreolus takes the passage. By contrast, Cajetan is mainly concerned to show that something much less improbable is required. He glosses at length the process of thought a person might go through when he or she first comes to the age of reason. And a part of this gloss is in passage 8. It is necessary that the first thing that occurs to the child's will is himself, to whom he orders all other desirable things. After the completion of this natural process, by which the child naturally wishes the good and happiness for himself, it follows that he is concerned about what should be desired for that which he loves above all other things, himself. And so he considers what is to be done, what sought for, what put up with, and whatever else is within his power. And because he is more loved according to himself than according to his parts or his partial characteristics, it follows that in considering this, the boy must deliberate what should be desired by him according to himself, not according to him in this or that respect. Now this is to deliberate about himself and order himself to the end, because that which is desirable for him as what he loves most according to himself as a whole is the end to which he is ordered. And so, if he judges that what he should seek after is the moral good, which he perceives in a confused way, as is normal at that age, he has deliberated well about himself, placing his end in true happiness, although imperfectly and incorrectly. For no more is demanded of the child. If not, he will be guilty of the sin of omission mentioned in the text in the answer to the third objection. In Aquinas' account, it's uncertain whether what is being described is a process of thought that we have good reason to believe happens, or rather just something that is required of us. Cajetan explains the process in a way that makes it psychologically plausible that it happens to everyone who reaches the age of reason, and shows how it can have either the outcome that obeys God's command, or, though the mechanism here is less clear, the outcome that goes against it. For Vittoria, this question of the first action when someone reaches the age of reason is even more important to his thinking about the salvation of pagans. So important that when he came to it in his lectures on the Summa, he promised to dedicate a whole relectio, a special lecture to it. And this is what he does in his relectio on what a person is required to do when he reaches the age of reason. Here, he explicitly connects his discussion with Aquinas' brief comments about the person brought up in a forest. But he's very clearly not thinking of, as Aquinas was, of an exceptional circumstance, but a situation in which many people find themselves, and one which in fact is also applicable, he says, to baptized Christian children. The first part of Vittoria's relectio is a careful consideration of what it means for someone to come to the age of reason. This is certainly not something which Vittoria thinks happens at a set age. Rather, to come to the age of reason is to be able to use one's free will, which a person can do only if he's master of his actions, and that requires that he has the power of deliberating about what is good and evil. Although every human has, as an essential property, the capacity to reason, physical impediments may prevent it from being exercised. And a good education is a great help in bringing somebody more quickly to the age of reason. Although Vittoria describes those adults who do not have the power of reason as being amentes, or lacking mental capacity, or even insane, he nonetheless hints that this could actually be quite a large category. Vittoria, in the rest of the lectio, goes even further down the path already taken by Cajetan, of insisting that it is not required that a person reaching the age of reason explicitly turns to God. We can indeed know God through natural reason, but as he explains, a look at the philosophical proofs for God's existence shows that it would require not a little time, as he says, to reach them if you didn't have an instructor. So nobody could be required to reach of even God's existence instantly on coming to reason. Vittoria does in fact believe that there was a primordial revelation of God's existence to all humans, and he looks to Cicero for the idea that no nation is so barbarous that it doesn't think that God exists. And yet, even this widely diffused knowledge doesn't mean that there couldn't easily be a short stretch of time between somebody coming to the use of reason and their learning about God. And then also, he mentions, there's the possibility, one can't exclude the theoretical possibility of Aquinas' this person in a forest. So, partly with Gregory of Rimini in his sights, Vittoria argues vigorously that someone coming to the age of reason can perform a morally good first act without making God explicitly its end. And he concludes this discussion, and unfortunately not time to look at some detail, as I did in passage 9. Therefore, St. Thomas's famous teaching about conversion to God in the first instance of the use of reason is to be understood in this way. Aquinas wanted simply that when someone first thinks and deliberates about his life, it is necessary that he has a purpose for the good, either in general or also fitting to knowledge of God. 4 years later, Vittoria wrote his famous Relax de Aenis. This work is a landmark in the history of the problem of paganism, both because it shows how sharply practical these issues now become, and because it draws into the area of discussion theories about natural law, the grounds of legitimate rule, and the grounds for just war, which had up until then been detached from it. This treatise, which is I think the most well-known of the works by the Thomists, other than Aquinas, that have been discussed and is widely available in translation. This treatise considers in turn the various general grounds which the Spaniards might give to justify their conquest of America, and then making the native people their subjects. For example, that the inhabitants are infidels, that they sin against natural law, that there is a duty to evangelize them, that the lands were given to the Spaniards by the Pope. All of these and more, though Vittoria stopped short of entirely condemning the conquest. With regard to the issues I've been considering, the one important new development, which scholars looking at it have mentioned, is actually largely based on Cajetan. Cajetan had said that you couldn't expect a